I'm not sure how to tell this story in a way that anyone will believe, but I have to share it. I've always been an honest person, and I know what I saw that day. As far as I know, I'm the only person who has ever come across this strange creature. I've talked to a lot of people about it, and no one has ever heard of anything like it. I've searched online too, but I can't find a single mention of anything similar. Despite all this, I'm certain about what I saw. I saw it plainly with my own eyes, in broad daylight, so there's no way I could have confused it with something else. Let me back up a bit. I'm a longtime fan of a radio show that shares stories about strange encounters, and I tune in regularly from my home in Caruthersville, Arkansas. This story, though, takes place a little east of home on Reelfoot Lake, which is in the northwestern corner of Tennessee. I've loved fishing ever since I was a kid, and last summer I was out on Reelfoot Lake trying to catch some big catfish. I had promised my brothers a fish fry for the following weekend, and I was determined to catch enough for all of us. My boat's fish finder was telling me there were several large fish swimming directly beneath me, so even though it was the hottest part of the day and I was hungry, thirsty, and nearly out of ice water, I wasn't going to move until I caught at least one or two. It was sweltering that day, and I was completely alone on the lake. In fact, I hadn't seen another boat for over an hour by the time something very strange happened. I grabbed my last bottle of ice water from the cooler and took a seat at the front of the boat. I cast out my line and sat quietly, waiting for a tug. As I wiped the sweat from my brow, I felt something bump the underside of the boat. It wasn't a hard bump, but it was strong enough to nearly knock me out of my seat and make me curious. I felt the need to scoot over and look down into the water to try to figure out what it was. At first glance, I couldn't see anything. The water was calm, and there was no sign of whatever had bumped the boat. I figured it must have been a tree just beneath the water's surface, or maybe one of those big catfish teasing me from below. I gave up scanning the water and went back to my seat to take another swig of water. Just as I was about to sit back down, there was another, much stronger bump under the boat. This time, I dropped my water bottle, spilling the last of it onto the boat's floor. Frustrated and curious, I rushed back to the boat's edge, determined to find out what was under the water. I grabbed one of the oars and decided to poke around under the boat to see if I could get anything to come up. But when I stuck the oar into the water, something grabbed onto it tightly, only for a second or two, then let go. When I pulled the oar back up, I was shocked to find that the entire paddle was missing. Whatever was under my boat had bitten the paddle clean off. At that point, I decided it was time to get out of there. I couldn't imagine what it might be, but my first thought was that some Tennessee hillbilly had released a pet alligator into the lake. I quickly tried to start the boat motor. It turned over once and then died. I tried again, but it died a second time. The third time, I couldn't even get it to turn over. Frustrated, I pulled the propeller out of the water to see if something was stuck. To my horror, all the blades were either broken off or bent. If it was an alligator, it must have had skin as thick as concrete to cause that kind of damage. I reached for my phone to call for help, and that's when I saw it. Rising up from the water, right under my boat, was a creature that looked like a snapping turtle, but it was unlike any snapping turtle I'd ever seen. It was at least 15 feet wide, and its head was as big as my torso. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I swear it was there, right in front of me. I was terrified that the creature was going to tip over my boat. For a moment, it just stared at me with those cold, dark eyes, and then it slowly submerged back into the water. The boat rocked violently from the current caused by the creature's descent, and I nearly lost my balance. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to get to shore. I grabbed the remaining oar and started paddling with all my strength. The sun was blazing, and I was already dehydrated from the heat. The journey back to shore was slow and exhausting with only one oar and no motor. It felt like hours before I finally reached the shore. I was drenched in sweat and completely worn out, but I was safe. I pulled the boat onto the shore and collapsed on the ground, too exhausted to move for a while. When I finally made it back home, I tried to tell my friends what had happened. Of course, none of them believed me. They laughed it off, saying I must have been overheated or hallucinating. But I know what I saw. We were attacked. It might sound strange, but that's exactly what happened. It was quick, sudden, and before we realized it, it was over. I wish I could say we were in a safe place, like a castle with strong walls, but we weren't. We were in a mobile home. At that time, I was parked in Arizona, right on the edge of the desert. I'm pretty sure I was on reservation land, maybe even trespassing, but I kept to myself, and no one bothered me. It was perfect for someone like me, someone who didn't like being around people too much. Somehow, in that lonely place, I made a couple of friends. Thomas and George were my only friends out there. Of course, those weren't their real names, but it doesn't matter. Their real names were just as common. You wouldn't guess they came from families that had lived there for generations, long before anyone else arrived. Maybe they didn't have much to do either, which is why they hung out with me in my old mobile home. We had a fire going that night. It burned almost all night while we had a few drinks and danced around. George even brought some of his friends, but they left early. I was glad Thomas and George stayed, though they might have regretted it later. They probably wished they had left me there alone. Then they wouldn't have seen what I saw. They wouldn't have had to fight. It must have been around 2 a.m. when we first heard it, something moving outside the mobile home. We were inside, sitting at the table, playing cards. Thomas heard it first. He looked at the windows, trying to figure out what it was. He grabbed a baseball bat and went outside to scare off whatever it was. We thought it was just coyotes. They come around sometimes, but they usually run away when you make noise. Thomas could be really loud when he wanted to be. Watching him act all tough always made George and me laugh. We followed him outside after a while. I remember George joking that we missed the show, but when we stepped out, Thomas was silent. He didn't turn back to us. He was staring at something on the other side of the fire. We looked over his shoulder to see what it was. It was a man, or at least, I think it was. He crouched low to the ground watching us. We couldn't see his face clearly through the flickering flames. George tried to scare him off, but another figure appeared beside the first. This one was a woman. We could see her face more clearly. It was strange, almost like a bat. Her nose was wide and flat, and her mouth was stretched back, showing too much of her gums and awkward teeth. If she had eyes, they weren't visible. George stopped talking after that. I was the first to run. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. Thomas followed, and George was right behind us. He locked the door as soon as we were inside. We stood there, panting and staring at the door, too afraid to move. Then something hit the door, hard. It wasn't soft like flesh. It was sharp and cracked as it struck. We found out later it was a burning log they had taken from our fire. Then came the rocks. It sounded like hail at first. The creatures outside howled and screamed, throwing whatever they could find at the mobile home. The windows cracked and shattered. We worried they might try to set the place on fire, but they didn't. Or maybe they weren't trying to hurt us at all. Maybe they just wanted to scare us. We pushed against the door and tried to block the windows, keeping them out. One of the rocks flew in and hit George on the head. He didn't fall, but he was shaky after that. Thomas yelled at them, even though they probably didn't understand a word he said. He kept shouting, hoping to drive them away. The creatures outside got bolder. Soon, instead of throwing things, they started slapping the walls with their hands, trying to break in. If they had tried the door, they probably could have forced their way inside. But after about an hour, everything went quiet. We heard them running off, back into the desert. When we finally opened the door, they were gone. But the outside of my mobile home was covered in dents and dirty handprints. Mud, blood, and other stuff smeared across the walls. None of us spoke that morning. We just cleaned up together. We scrubbed the walls with what little water we had and some vodka. We didn't say a word. We wanted to forget what had happened, to pretend it was just a bad dream. After that, the guys left. I stayed until the sun started to set. When I thought I heard something outside, I left immediately. I had the mobile home towed away. The towing company fined me for its condition. Apparently, it was filthy again. The inside was trashed and smelled awful, like animals had been inside. I sold it as soon as I could. This is the truth. That's what happened. When I wake up tomorrow, I'll probably be too scared to talk about it again. It was supposed to be just another day on the trails, a routine ride through the woods that I'd done a dozen times before. I was feeling the thrill of the ride as I raced down the path. The wheels of my bike hummed beneath me, and I couldn't help but grin at the speed and freedom I felt. But then, without warning, the trail became rougher than I'd expected. I hit a rock that sent my bike into a wild jolt. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, my bike lying next to me with a bent wheel. I groaned, brushing dirt off my hands and knees. My heart was still racing from the fall, but now it was mixed with frustration. I checked my bike, hoping it wasn't too badly damaged. But the wheel was twisted and the chain had come off. I couldn't ride it like this. I was miles from the nearest road, deep in the woods, and the sun was already dipping lower in the sky. I had a toolkit in my backpack, so I set to work, trying to fix the bike. As I crouched there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were usually full of the sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant animal. But now, it was eerily quiet. The quietness began to get to me. My fingers fumbled with the chain, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I liked to admit. I told myself it was just nerves after the fall, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The stillness wasn't normal. I was just about to get the chain back in place when I heard something. A rustling noise, not too far away, but not close enough for me to see what it was. I froze, my hand gripping the chain so tightly that the grease began to smear on my palm. My eyes scanned the trees, trying to spot the source of the sound. Then I heard it again, a low, almost growling sound. My heart pounded harder, and I slowly stood up, holding my bike as if it could offer some sort of protection. I knew the stories about these woods, about the creature some people claim to have seen, the Jersey Devil. I always thought it was just a legend, a scary tale people told around campfires. But in that moment, with the strange sound echoing in my ears, I wasn't so sure. I kept my eyes on the trees, my mind racing. The growl came again, this time closer. My pulse quickened, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. I didn't know what to do. My bike was broken, and I was alone. Just as panic started to take hold, I heard something else, another sound, but this one was different. It was the faint hum of a bike, getting louder. I turned, hoping against hope that it wasn't just my imagination. Through the trees, I caught sight of another biker approaching, his figure a blur as he sped down the trail. Relief washed over me. The other biker must have seen the look on my face because he slowed down and stopped next to me. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. "I think so," I replied, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "But my bike's busted, and there's something out there." I gestured vaguely toward the trees where the growl had come from. The biker looked in the direction I'd pointed, his expression serious. He didn't laugh or brush it off, which somehow made me feel a little better. "I've heard the stories," he said quietly, "but I've never seen anything myself. Let's get your bike fixed and get out of here." I nodded, grateful that I wasn't alone anymore. Together, we worked on my bike, and it was amazing how quickly the fear started to fade with someone else there. The other biker was quick with his hands, and he seemed to know exactly what to do. Within minutes, he had the wheel straightened out and the chain back in place. "All set," he said, giving me a reassuring nod. "Let's get moving." I didn't need to be told twice. We both mounted our bikes and started pedaling down the trail, the sound of our wheels on the dirt a comforting rhythm. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, but now that I had company, it didn't feel as threatening. As we rode, I kept my eyes forward, trying to push the strange encounter out of my mind. But I couldn't forget the sound I'd heard, the way the woods had felt just before the other biker showed up. I glanced over at him, wondering if he was thinking the same thing. We didn't talk much as we rode, just focused on getting out of the woods. But after a while, when the trees started to thin and I could see the fading light of day more clearly, I finally felt like I could breathe again. When we reached the edge of the woods, the other biker slowed down and came to a stop. I did the same, looking back at the trail we'd just come down. It seemed almost normal now, just a simple path through the trees. But I knew better. "Thanks," I said, turning to the biker who had helped me. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." "Don't mention it," he replied with a small smile. "I'm just glad I was around. These woods can play tricks on you sometimes." "Yeah," I agreed, though I knew that what I'd heard hadn't been a trick. It had been real, just as real as the bike beneath me. The deep ocean always fascinated me. My name is Jamie, and I've spent most of my life studying the mysteries of the sea as a marine biologist. Every dive into the depths brought new discoveries, but nothing could have prepared me for the day we encountered Giglioli's whale. It was an ordinary morning on our research vessel, the Blue Explorer. The sun shone brightly, and the waves gently rocked our boat as we prepared for another day of underwater exploration. Our mission was simple: explore a newly discovered trench deep in the Pacific Ocean. Little did we know, this day would be anything but ordinary. We had a small team on board: Dr. Kim, our lead scientist, who was always full of curiosity; Theo, our expert navigator; and me, Jamie, the biologist with a passion for all things living in the ocean. We had also brought along the latest in submersible technology, a small, sleek submarine we affectionately called Deep Blue. The trench we were about to explore was one of the deepest ever discovered. It was so deep that sunlight could not reach the bottom, and the pressure down there was immense. Only the bravest, or perhaps the most curious, would dare to explore such a place. After a quick breakfast, we climbed into Deep Blue, checked all the systems, and started our descent. As we slowly sank into the ocean's depths, the light began to fade, and the water around us grew darker and colder. It wasn't long before we were surrounded by nothing but blackness, with only the lights from our sub guiding the way. "Keep your eyes peeled, team," Dr. Kim said over the radio. "This trench could be hiding species we've never seen before." The walls of the trench were rugged and covered with strange-looking corals and plants. Occasionally we'd spot a fish or two, but for the most part, it was eerily quiet. The silence was only broken by the hum of the sub's engine and the occasional crackle from our radio. Hours passed as we explored the trench, and though we saw many fascinating creatures, nothing could have prepared us for what happened next. Suddenly our radar started beeping. Something large was moving in the water nearby. My heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling with excitement. "I see it," Theo replied, trying to pinpoint the location of the object. "It's big, whatever it is." Dr. Kim adjusted the lights, pointing them in the direction of the blip on our radar. The water around us was so dark that even with the powerful lights, it was hard to see anything clearly. But then, out of the darkness, something extraordinary appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, a massive shape moving gracefully through the water, but as it drew closer, we could see it more clearly. It was a whale, but unlike any whale we had ever seen before. It was enormous, at least 60 feet long, with sleek, dark skin that shimmered in the light. But what caught our attention were the two dorsal fins on its back. Most whales have only one, but this one had two, which immediately reminded me of something I had read about long ago. Could it be Giglioli's whale? Dr. Kim whispered in awe. Giglioli's whale was something of a legend among marine biologists. First spotted over 100 years ago, it was a species that few had ever seen and many believed to be extinct or a myth. The only thing that set it apart from other whales was its two dorsal fins. And here it was, right in front of us. We stared in disbelief as the whale swam gracefully past our submarine. It moved so smoothly, like a ghost in the water, its massive body cutting through the ocean with ease. For a moment, it seemed to be curious about us, slowing down as if to take a closer look. I pressed my face against the glass, not wanting to miss a single detail. The whale's eyes were large and dark, and for a brief moment, it felt like it was looking right at me. There was something ancient and wise in those eyes, something that made me feel incredibly small in comparison. "Get the cameras rolling," Dr. Kim shouted, snapping me out of my trance. We quickly activated all our recording equipment, hoping to capture as much footage as possible. But as quickly as it had appeared, the whale began to swim away. It moved with such speed and grace that within moments it was gone, disappearing back into the darkness from which it had come. We tried to follow it, but it was too fast. All we could do was watch as the radar blip grew smaller and smaller until it vanished completely. Silence filled the submarine once again. None of us spoke for a while, still processing what we had just witnessed. Finally, Theo broke the silence. "Did that really just happen?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Dr. Kim replied, her voice filled with wonder. "We just saw Giglioli's whale." I couldn't believe it. After years of studying marine life, I had just seen something that most people only dream of. My heart was still pounding with excitement. "We need to get back to the surface," Dr. Kim said, her voice now filled with urgency. "We need to analyze the footage and make sure we have everything we need to prove what we just saw." Theo turned the sub around, and we began our ascent back to the surface. The journey back felt like it took forever, but I couldn't stop thinking about the whale. The way it moved, the way it looked at us, it was all so surreal. One sunny afternoon, my little brother Jordan and I decided to play in the backyard. We grabbed our binoculars, ready to spot some birds. We loved watching them flutter around, building nests in the trees. It was our favorite thing to do on weekends. As we were searching the sky, Jordan suddenly gasped. "Look over there," he said, pointing to a bright light far in the sky. It wasn't moving like a plane or a bird. It just hung there, glowing and strange. I squinted through my binoculars, trying to figure out what it was. "What do you think it is?" I asked Jordan. "I don't know," he replied, sounding puzzled. "Maybe it's a star?" "But it's daytime," I reminded him. "You can't see stars during the day." We stared at the light for a few more minutes, but it didn't make any sense. Finally, I had an idea. "Let's go ask Dad," I said. We ran inside, our binoculars bouncing on our chests. "Dad, Dad," we called, finding him in the kitchen. "There's a weird light in the sky and we don't know what it is." Dad followed us outside, shading his eyes as he looked up. We handed him the binoculars, and he took a long look at the light. After a moment, he lowered the binoculars and smiled. "Well, kids, that could be a UFO." "A UFO?" Jordan and I said at the same time. Our eyes went wide with excitement. "Yep," Dad said. "It stands for Unidentified Flying Object. It just means it's something in the sky that we can't explain." "Wow," Jordan whispered, still staring at the light. "Do you think it's from outer space?" Dad chuckled. "It's possible, but it could also be something like a weather balloon or a drone. The fun part is, we might never know." Jordan and I exchanged looks. A UFO. We couldn't wait to tell our friends. The light stayed in the sky for a little while longer, then slowly faded away. We didn't see it again, but we kept our binoculars close, just in case it came back. From that day on, every time we looked up at the sky, we wondered what else might be out there.